Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friend Ricky Allison, and Ricky and I are continuing our overview of the book of Acts. And today we're talking about Philip ministering in Samaria. And we're using Acts chapter 1, verse 8 as our outline of the book of Acts, where it talks about you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And we're taking the book of Acts and using that as an outline. Jerusalem church, Judea and Samaria church, and then the uttermost parts of the earth, which is basically the record Paul going on his missionary journeys and spreading the church all over. But we're going to see Philip, and we're going to be looking at his ministry today in Judea and Samaria. And we'll do that when we come right back. Welcome back to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to show and grow a passion for studying God's Word. And listen, this is a real Bible study. We decided to share with you and have you sit in on this. This is a different kind of Bible study in that it's not a verse-by-verse study. It's not even a topical study. This is an overview study. And Ricky and I did this for the book of Genesis, and we're doing it again for the book of Acts to give us a feel for the major events that move the narrative along for the book of Acts. And we hope you enjoy it. If you do, hit the subscribe button and the like button and comment. Love your comments. We're getting positive comments. And listen, if you're interested in the ministry of Bible Study with Friends, there's a website in the description below. And we would welcome you to come look at what we do and how we do it and why we. And there's also a video menu that you can hit, and it'll show you every playlist in our YouTube ministry. You hit on one of those playlists, and it takes you right to the videos. And we'd invite you to check that out when you get a chance. Let's get into.
It's super easy to jump around to whatever you're wanting to study. You've done a great job of making it super easy with each book. Hey, go here for Mark, go here for Genesis. So it's whatever you kind of topic or book of the Bible you're interested in. You've made it super easy for people to follow along.
Yeah, and you can go to the YouTube channel, obviously, and you can look at playlists and that sort of thing. But the YouTube playlists that are listed and linked in the website are really easier for you. You can read the title, like Acts, the book of Action. That playlist, it'll be obvious. It's Acts, and it's what it's about. And you hit on that, and it'll take you to the very first video in the playlist. And from that, off to the right is a list of every video in the playlist. It's super easy, and we'd invite you to come to that. But listen, let's get into our study. This is interesting. We're going to pick up in chapter 8 of Acts. We're going to cover from verse 1 to verse 5, and then we're going to verse 25, and we're going to go to verse 40. And that's the story of Philip. But before we do that, I want to start. Let's get into the word here.
I was hoping you weren't going to skip over one of my favorite verses.
Okay. When we come to your favorite verse, you be sure to tell us. And if I try to skip it, you call us back. Let's start at verse 1 of chapter 8. Now, last week, we talked about the first Christian to die for the faith. The first martyr was Stephen. And we saw that Saul then was there when Stephen was killed for the faith. And I want you to pick up real quick, and I want us to see what happens here. This follows right after that. Read verse 1 and verse 3.
I'll try to read verse 1, but even looking at it, it wells up my emotions that I feel about it, because 8:1 is one of my favorite verses.
Okay, good. I didn't skip it.
No, you didn't skip it.
That's great. Okay.
So Saul was in heartily agreement with the putting him to death. And on that day of great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were scattered throughout the regions of Judea, Samaria, except the apostles. But Paul began ravaging the church, entering house after house and dragging off men and women. he would put them in prison.
All right. So here's where we start to see, because of persecution and really from Paul. Now, he's ravaging the church. What's the church?
The people
And where is the church
in Jerusalem
that he's ravaging? There's only one church, and that's in Jerusalem. And so he is focusing his persecution on the Jerusalem church. Now, what that does is that starts to scatter people who are running from persecution. And in verse 1, it talks about, and they all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. Remember, our outline is Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts. So there, God is using persecution, a tough thing, for a positive effect, and that is he's sending people out to spread the gospel all through Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. Now the apostles stay, and from here on in the book of Acts, Jerusalem is only mentioned. It's not, there's really not a lot about the church in Jerusalem. This outline is starting to move out. We're seeing this moving out, and Saul is ravaging the church.
I love that phrase, heartily agreement. Like probably the second most important person aside from Jesus in the New Testament is Saul here. And there was a time where he was in heartily agreement.
Yeah, with
killing. And so,
and he never forgot the fact that he was involved with killing Christians before he accepted Christ.
So if you're somebody who's watching this and you think you've gone too far, or you've messed up too much, or you can't be brought back, we see what's happened to Paul here, that this is who he was, and yet what was the difference that made his life? He encountered Christ.
Yeah.
And
I had a question one time, a guy sent me, why should we read anything about Paul? Because he was a murderer. He killed people, but it is a picture of grace that God still was interested in saving Paul's soul and using him in a mighty way. Yep. And we have other people. David was a murderer. We have other people who are great men of God who repented and were used of God as a picture of grace. And yep. Paul is certainly a picture of grace.
Definitely.
We have this introduction that the persecution is really going, and the persecution is pushing people out into Samaria and Judea. And then it says in verse 4, therefore those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. So they were being spread out and they were preaching the word. Now they are not mentioned by name, except now we're going to zero in on one who had been scattered and who was beginning to preach. In verse 5, Philip went down to the city of Samaria, and that's the capital city of Samaria. And he goes down. Now, Philip was not an apostle. Philip was one of the deacons, again, like Stephen. And he went and started to preach in Samaria. So there's people in Judea and Samaria. He goes through Judea and moves up into Samaria, and he goes to the main city of Samaria, and he began proclaiming Christ. Now, here's where I want to skip, because right here, over here in my notes, this chapter is where the witness in Judea and Samaria really starts. We're going to see various major things in this move from Judea, Samaria, and the ministry there. And today we're going to see a very interesting major event. And I want to stop here and move to the next verse. Now, we see here jumping down to verse 25. When they had solemnly testified and spoken the word of the Lord, they started back to Jerusalem. And this is when the ministry starts to happen outside of Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria. They send Peter and John, and they check it out, and they say, yeah, people are accepting Christ, and this is great. They're heading back to Jerusalem. And it says, they started back and were preaching the gospel to many villages of the Samaritans. So even on the trip back to Jerusalem, they're ministering in Judea and Samaria. Do you see that movement?
Yep.
Okay. Philip and John and Peter are all ministering up in Judea and Samaria, and people are all over the place being spread out from Jerusalem, and they're preaching to Samaria and Judea. The place is growing. There's churches being established. In verse 25, many villages of the Samaritans. And then it says an interesting word in verse 26. But an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, get up and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem south into Gaza. I really like this part, Ricky, where he's got a going ministry in lots of villages in the area. But he is the pastor of a lot of little churches all over Samaria. And the churches are growing, and he's ministering. And if he looked at his ministry and said, man, God is really blessing, we are doing churches all over Samaria, this is great. And then all of a sudden, God says to him, yeah, but I want you to stop that ministry, and I want you to go to the middle of nowhere, to a desert road. It's interesting here that Samaria and Judea is this whole area, including Gaza, but Samaria is north of Jerusalem. Where is God sending Philip?
South.
To desert road in the middle of nowhere, heading south. And it's interesting. Read verse 27, and there's a ton of really good details in verse 27.
So he got up and went, and there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all of her treasure, and he had come to Jerusalem to worship.
Okay,
Candace.
And he's a eunuch, an Ethiopian eunuch. Now we got to ask him. The first observation is, God says, stop your ministry and go to the middle of nowhere. And so what does he do? I love that first.
So he got up and went.
There was no discussion, I can't leave these ministries. I'm really busy over here. Maybe I'll get to it later on, Lord. He just basically obeys. And what a great lesson for us. And I've been involved with great ministries that were a real blessing, like when I was at Silverdale Baptist in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And all of a sudden, because of God's movement in Bev's life with her cancer, all of a sudden we were asked to pull up everything, sell everything, and move out of Chattanooga, which we loved, and our church, which we loved, and come to Salt Lake City, where we didn't know anybody. We found a great church here and have settled in, praise God. But God moved us, and we felt the need to just obey. And here's a great example of that. Now, the next question we come to, he goes up and he goes there out in the middle of the desert, and there was an Ethiopian eunuch. Now, where is Ethiopia?
Is that Africa?
It's in Africa. It's about halfway between Alexandria in Egypt and the Straits of Gibraltar, which leave the Mediterranean and go out into the Atlantic. So it's along the northern coast of Africa, about halfway. So even Ethiopia was in the middle of nowhere. And Ethiopia is really the beginning of the uttermost parts of the earth. Okay. And here is an Ethiopian. Now, he's a black man and he's a eunuch. So it's very interesting that all of a sudden we get details of the Lord bringing a black man into the family of God. And Philip didn't bat an eye. He's an Ethiopian eunuch. He serves as a high court official in the Queen of Ethiopia, whose name is Candace. Candace is a good biblical name, by the way. And Candace is the Queen of Ethiopia. And he was in charge of all of her treasure. So this guy's no dummy. And he has a responsible job. You could call him a chief steward to the court of Ethiopia.
Do you see, this will probably be off topic here, going down a rabbit trail, but do you see any parallel between this story and the woman of Jesus' ministry was blowing and going, and then he had to go to Samaria, and Philip's blowing and going, and he had to go to, both.
And when Jesus talks to a woman, a Samaritan woman, it breaks all kinds of racial and social and even sexual mores of the culture in order to share and win this woman to Christ. And here, Philip, who is a Jewish Christian, and he sees a black man in a chariot, doesn't know much about him yet, but he sees a black man in a chariot, and he notices that this black man is reading out of the book of Isaiah. Now, we're told that he was coming from Jerusalem to go back to Ethiopia. He'd been in Jerusalem to worship. Now, we don't know whether he was a convert to the Jewish faith, a proselyte, or whether he was a seeker and just went up to Jerusalem to really check out what all this worship of Yahweh and Jehovah was about.
Yep.
But either way, he's got his Bible open to the book of Isaiah, right? So immediately Philip says, oh, this is a guy who's reading out of the Bible. Now, there wasn't a New Testament Bible at that point, so he's reading out of the Bible. And he was sitting in his chariot and was reading the prophet Isaiah, verse 28. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go up and join this chariot. So Philip runs and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet. That means he was reading out loud. And he yells to him, do you understand what you're reading? Which is a great opening. I've walked up to people who are sitting in a Starbucks with a Bible open, and I walk up and say, hi, I see you're reading the Bible. Do you understand what you're reading? And most of the time they're Christians, and they say, yeah, and there's a great opportunity for fellowship, but sometimes they say, well, this is an assignment at school, and I've got to read this, and no, I really don't get it, can I sit down and talk? It's a great opening for witnessing, and that's what Philip does. He's led by the Spirit, and he says, do you understand what you're reading? And the answer is, how could I understand unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip. Now, that basically means he had nobody in his life at that time. Even though he'd gone up to the Jews in Jerusalem, there wasn't a teacher in Jerusalem who had really embraced teaching him. He says, I'm reading this because it's a wonderful book, but I really am not getting it yet because I don't have a teacher. And he invited to come up and sit with him. So up to this point, Philip is running along next to this chariot saying, hey, do you understand? And the guy says, why don't you get in and we can talk? It's a great picture, but it really is a picture of being led of the Spirit to talk to somebody who perhaps you may not have talked to otherwise without the Holy Spirit leading you and an opening. And what he does is, we don't have to read it all here, but what he does is he reads out of Isaiah 52, verse 7. Now you can go to Isaiah 52 and read the whole chapter, Isaiah 52, and then read Isaiah 53, because he is reading right into Jesus as the Messiah. And he's reading this and he quotes it. And Philip starts to give him the gospel. And the eunuch answered Philip and said, please tell me, of whom does the prophet say this? Of himself or someone else? That's a great question. And continuing on, we're going to see here the rest of the story. When Philip opened his mouth and began from this scripture, and he preached Jesus to this eunuch, to this black man, out in the middle of nowhere, okay, in the back of a dusty chariot. And he shares the gospel from the book of Isaiah. And if you're going to witness to a Jewish person who has never read the New Testament, doesn't want to know anything about the New Testament, Isaiah 52 and 53 are great places to use to share Jesus as the Messiah.
Yep.
And Jewish people are becoming Christians like crazy reading those two chapters of Isaiah. It's great. And they were going along, he preached Jesus, and all of a sudden, as they went along in verse 36, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, water, what prevents me from being baptized? And basically, Philip lays out how people can become Christian. If you believe with all of your heart, you may be baptized. He answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And he ordered the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water. So this is a pond or something. This is not just a sprinkling. This is an immersion.
Yep.
Philip as well as the eunuch, and he baptized him. And they came out of the water, and the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away, and the eunuch no longer saw him, but went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself in Azotus, and he passed through and kept preaching the Gospels until he came to Caesarea. So he goes back, and he's preaching all the way through Samaria until he gets back up into that area of Caesarea. So what, and we could go, what happens then? What happens is this eunuch who's praising the Lord, he's a Christian, he's been baptized as a Christian, he's got this message of the gospel. He goes back to Ethiopia, and to this day, Ricky, there is a huge Christian church in Black Ethiopia. They're really an on-fire church in Ethiopia.
All because Philip was obedient.
All because Philip heard, leave the churches you're doing and what you've been obedient in Samaria, but I want you to leave that and go in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And he just does.
Well, it's a great testimony that you may be blowing and going with what you're doing, but if God calls you somewhere else, there's no telling what he's going to do with the people you come in contact with going forward.
And we should not fight this idea. I've seen people that are business people or in a ministry in their church or whatever, and God calls them to the mission field. And they say, we're being led to leave our family, our friends, our church, and go to the middle of nowhere on a desert road and maybe minister to Black people, which is right out of the book of Acts. And this is the beginning of a church in Ethiopia. And later we know that apostles go down to Ethiopia and minister, and there's a church there. There's a church in Alexandria, Egypt. That's where Barnabas takes young John Mark and ministers to him down there. And so we're starting to see the church move out from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and move towards the uttermost parts. Now, next week, we're going to see the road to Damascus, where there is a click to the tool that God is going to use to go to the uttermost parts of the earth. Now, he's using the disciples. He's using guys like Philip and people from Jerusalem who are spread out through the area. But he's going to use as a major tool the Apostle Paul. And we're going to see that starting next week in our discussion and our overview. Any other comments? It's a great story.
It's a crazy story that this guy comes to faith, he gets baptized, and the guy that shares the gospel with him and baptizes him disappears all of a sudden.
Yeah.
I just think it's the craziest story and it says that he went on rejoicing. You wonder if he was like, what was going through his mind? This is insane.
Oh, that was interesting.
Yeah.
The guy who led me to the Lord is now gone.
Has been taken back to the Lord.
But I'm gonna focus on what I've learned and focus on the Lord. And I'm gonna go back to Ethiopia rejoicing. Yeah. What a great picture. What a great picture.
That's why I think I really see the parallels here with the woman because she goes back and tells people.
City. That's right. And
cool stories
Jesus
about going after that one person.
Yep. And this is a picture of key people. The Ethiopian eunuch he's a key person in the church in Ethiopia. And Saul is going to be a key person in going to the uttermost parts of the earth. And we're going to pick that up next week. Listen, I hope you guys have enjoyed this on YouTube. If it was a blessing, subscribe. There's more to come. And we'll be following this overview of the book of Acts through to the end. We've gotten some great comments, and they are a huge encouragement to us. And we appreciate that. And I answer all our comments. Please feel free to do that. And listen, we're going to pick up in chapter 9 in our overview next week. And then we'll really start to move the book of Acts. And we'll do that next week. God bless you. We'll talk to you then.